Hello, hi guys. I am Rohil, the children's pastor at St. Peter's Church, and all of you are so welcome to our Rock Solid session this online way. So, last few weeks we've been learning about God's nature, what is He like, and maybe how we could be a teeny bit like Him and share those similar values, the nature of God. And this week I have another story and God's nature to share with you. Now, if you could guess, this one starts with the alphabet F, okay? And it is actually one of the fruit of the Spirit, as well as, you know that song, Love, Joy, Peace, Patience? That one. So it's one of the fruit of the Spirit, and it starts with the alphabet F. Can you guess, if you can go back to the thing? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. It should hit you. If you haven't, it is, drum roll, faithfulness. So God is faithful. So this week we'll be learning more about that. So what are you waiting for? Let's go. Some of us would know what the word faith or faithful or faithfulness means, but I am sure there are quite a few of us who still might not understand what does the word faithful mean. So here I have some thoughts. I'll tell you, faithfulness is we take that. Faithfulness is okay, I need some help. Guys, can you please help me with this? What does faithfulness mean, or being faithful?
Nathan, what does it mean to be faithful? To be faithful means to be loyal, obedient, reliable, and trust. For example, Abraham and Sarah relied on God for a baby. God was faithful and gave them a baby boy, Isaac.
Oh guys, thank you so much for that. Indeed, that was a very well expressed way of saying the word faithful. Did you just ask what am I doing with this little baby? Sorry, I forgot to tell you. Today's story is about a baby. Well, it's actually about God's promise. It's God being faithful, but to whom? Now, you might have heard about Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. Remember? Father Abraham. So, yeah, that Abraham. So, Abraham and Sarah are the people who we'll be learning about. But most importantly, it's God's promise to them. God promises them something very special. Let's watch this video and find out God's promise.
God's story, God's promise to Abraham. So part of God's story is about a promise God made to Abraham, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Abraham. He had a wife, Sarah. They didn't think they could have any kids, which was a major disappointment because they really wanted a family. But little did Abraham know that God had a very special plan for him. When Abraham was 75 years old, God promised to give him kids, and one day God would send the rescuer through his family. All God asked was that Abraham and Sarah leave their home first and follow him. Now, they had a tough choice to make: leave all their friends and trust God, or stay comfortable. This was not easy. See, Abraham really wanted kids, but was already pretty old. Sarah was getting up there too. Not to mention, she had never been able to get pregnant. So if Abraham and Sarah were going to leave their home and trust in God's promise, they had to believe that God would do something that seemed impossible. The good news is, they decided to trust that God would keep His promise. That's always the right choice. So Abraham and Sarah moved from their home to a land called Canaan. Right away, God reminded Abraham of His promise. He said, "I will make your children like the dust of the earth. Can specks of dust be counted? If they can, then your children can be counted." This was God's funny way of telling Abraham he would have a lot of kids, because nobody can count every piece of dust. Well, this promise seemed great, but after a while, Abraham and Sarah still had no kids, let alone as many as the pieces of dust. Now, they were really old. Sometimes God doesn't remind us of his promises because he wants us to learn to trust him. But God took Abraham outside at night and told him to look at the stars. He reminded Abraham that he would give him that many kids. So Abraham decided to keep believing God. He and Sarah waited again. After more years, he got impatient. This time, God told Abraham, by next year, Sarah will have a son. But by now, Abraham was 99 years old. He and Sarah had both given up on having kids and God's promise. In fact, when Abraham told Sarah what God said, she laughed. It's probably not a good idea to laugh at God's promises, but Sarah was tired of waiting and had stopped trusting. The great thing is, even if we think it's impossible, God really does keep his promises. And just like God promised, Sarah got pregnant the next year after Abraham's 100th birthday. When her son was born, she named him Isaac, which means laughter. Sarah said, God has given laughter to me. Everybody who hears about this will laugh with me. And think about it. A really old lady having a baby is pretty funny. God kept his promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. Even though they didn't think it was possible, it was easy for God because he can do anything, including giving old people babies. And remember how God was going to give Abraham as many children as the stars in the sky? Well, Isaac grew up and had children who had more children who had more children. This kept going and going and going. And guess who eventually was born in Abraham's line? The rescuer himself, God's son, Jesus. All because Abraham followed God and trusted God to keep his promise. And that's the story of God's promise to Abraham. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Abraham and Sarah were old. God promised to give Abraham kids. Abraham and Sarah waited. They got impatient. God reminded them he keeps his promises. Abraham and Sarah waited more. They got impatient again. God told them Sarah would have a baby. Sarah laughed. She had a baby. Jesus was eventually born into their family. God always keeps his promises. And that's a part of God's story.
Oh, you're back. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's keep you somewhere safely on this side, just so the baby can go back to sleep. There we are. Great story. God's faithfulness, God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. How cheeky was Sarah to laugh, wasn't she? But hey ho. Anyway, so guys, faithfulness is simply being loyal and standing firm to your choices, to your belief, or to a person, to an organization. Now, for example, let's say you have your favorite cartoon, or you have your favorite football team, right? Or your favorite musician. And say when they release a new album, or there's a new match, or there's a new episode of your favorite cartoon, you want to watch that, you want to be faithful, you want to, if there are any obstacles in your way, you want to get to that episode, to that match, to watch it. That is you being faithful, you're sticking up. Sometimes also when your team loses, right? Especially with the football fans, when your team loses, you are still faithful. You don't change your team. You don't go to some other team and be like, oh, I'm going to support you because you are winning. Or even in your friends. If you have a very good friend in times of difficulties or tough times, you stand with them. You stick with your friends, don't you? That is being faithful. And just like we saw in today's story, God was faithful to Abraham and Sarah. God promised them that he will give them a child. Now, the funny thing is, they laughed. They didn't realize that, they were true, because when you get older, it gets difficult to have a baby. And Abraham and Sarah were really old, really old. And they laughed and they were like, God, how can we have a baby? But you know what? God can do anything, can't he? Can just someone say God can do anything? Well done. God can do anything. So just with that note, know that just like how God was faithful to his promise, when we make a promise to someone, we should be faithful as well. And even especially if we make a promise to God. If we tell God, I promise next week I will do this, or I promise that I will not do this. firstly, promising to God is a big thing. We shouldn't really say the word promise, because then it's difficult to keep it, and we should keep it, but we can fail sometimes. But what we can say is, God, please, I will try my very best to not do this or to do this thing, and be faithful, right? So that's the story of God's faithfulness. God wants us to be faithful to Him, but also to those around us. So if you've made any promises recently, think about them and make sure you try your level best to give it all in. And sometimes we can fail, because we are humans, right? We can fail, but saying a sorry and trying harder next time always helps. So remember, instead of a promise, we can always say, I will try my level best to make sure that I do this. Okay? God bless. Now that we've learned a little bit about God being faithful to us and how we can be faithful to Him, it is time for our prayers. So, like always, I can't do everything by myself, so I've got little helpers to help me pray this week. And we go together. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5.
Dear God, thank you for being faithful to us. Help us to be faithful to others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks for our prayers, guys. It's always a pleasure. Now it is time for our thoughts to be left with. Now, if you think that you have been promising someone something, it's about time that you actually think, am I fulfilling that promise? Am I being faithful to that person or to that friend or whatever it may be? Go back with a thought tonight or whenever you go to bed and think about that little promise that you must have made or you might have made to someone. And think about if you could, do you need to work harder to stay on that promise, or do you need to actually get up and fulfill that promise? Be faithful to whoever you made that promise from. But most importantly, remember that God above would be really happy. He loves you. He would love if you make a promise to Him, or if you say, God, I will try my best to pray every night before I go to bed. Make that little commitment to God and be faithful on it. On that note, we'll see you next week. God bless. Have a brilliant week, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Ethan, when have you been faithful? When everybody misplaces something, they rely on me to fetch it, and I always find it.